All right, we're going to get started here. So thanks everyone for attending. We're going to do a webinar here on cold water bass fishing, and I'm Tyler Brinks. So again, thanks for attending. This is the second webinar that I've done this year. We're going to have another one coming up and we'll talk about it, but we'll just go ahead and jump right into it. I'll kind of tell you a little bit about who I am, and this will be recorded. So if you have to, leave or anything, it will be on YouTube afterwards. I'll put it on my personal YouTube. It's just YouTube/Tyler Brinks, and it will also be on the Navionics YouTube probably tomorrow. So they're usually pretty quick on getting it going. So if you have any questions, just feel free to enter them at any time. We will get to them. I'll stop periodically to look for questions, and if not, we'll get them all at the end. But feel free to ask anything. And we're going to talk about cold water bass fishing. Like I said, I'll tell you a little bit about who I am. Basically, I work fishing. That's all I do. So I'm an outdoor writer. I work for a lot of different brands within the fishing industry, and I fish a lot. So, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is stuff that I've gathered through my own personal experience, tournament fishing, but also a lot that I learned from pros, both fishing with them and writing articles as well. And I've been able to practice that and do it. And, that's really what it's all about is learning. And that's what I'm here to do, is to teach you some of what I've learned about cold water bass fishing. So we'll go ahead and jump right into it. All right, so we'll break down the agenda. So, really, what is cold to you? I mean, that could be totally different things for where you live. I mean, it's really, relative to where you live. I lived in Florida for a while, and cold down there was, if it got in the 60s, that's freezing. But, here in Washington State where I live, 60s, summer day. I mean, it doesn't get too much warmer than that. So it's really just different based on where you're at. So we'll kind of talk about some different ranges that I consider. We'll also talk about spring versus fall, because my theory is that it's a lot different, and there's a lot of similarities as well. Same with largemouth versus smallmouth. And we're going to talk about a lot of different approaches. We're going to talk about bait selection, locations, and then, like I said, the Q&A. Okay, so how cold is cold? I mean, this is really cold. This was, this past fall. Actually, it was in December, and I was having little slushies made as I was reeling in my bait, so it was very cold, and guides were freezing up. It was just not a fun time, but the fish were biting. So that is really cold for me. I think it's cold for anywhere if the water's in the 30s, and that's what it was. It was 39 degrees when we launched. We caught a lot of fish. So like I said, how cold is cold? I mean, that varies based on the region. It's all different. Here in the Northwest, I would say cold is 40s and 50s, but that's really warm for a lot of different regions. So it varies based on region. And there's also a big thing about a sudden cold versus something that's a little bit more prolonged. You always hear about cold fronts in bass fishing. If it gets cold overnight, that has a lot bigger impact than if it's just been cold for a month straight. The fish do get used to it, and they do still need to eat. So they need to eat. They may not eat as much. They may not want to move as much to eat, but they still got to eat. But if it's a sudden cold front, that is a time when they do not eat as much. And also the spring versus the fall is totally different. 40 degrees in the spring and 40 degrees in the fall is different, because it's just warming up to 40, so the fish are getting a little more active. Or if it's cooling down to 40 degrees, they're really just slowing down. So it's just completely different. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about the cooling down versus the warming up. So the main ranges that I put together, and this could be different again based on where you live, but I would say the 50 to 55 is a range that's pretty cold. And then also the 40 to 50 degree range, and then the under 40. I've caught bass in the 30s. I've caught bass through the ice. Like I said earlier, they still need to eat. They're just not going to eat as much. You're going to have to move slower. You're going to have to change your approach, but you're still going to be able to catch them, just maybe not as easily as you would if the water's in the 60s or 70s. So, kind of touching on what I was talking about, the cooling down or warming up. So, as it's cooling down in the fall, that's actually one of my favorite times to fish, because it signals fish need to eat because they're going to be slowing down for the winter. So that is a time when fishing's really good. Then again, the warming up in the spring, that signals spawning. They're moving out of their winter locations. They're getting closer and closer to spawning. But both of those situations require forage, they need to eat. I mean, that's what they are. They live to eat. So they're going to need to be able to find forage somehow, whether that is, bluegill or crawfish or shad or whatever it is, they need to eat something, and that's just really what it what their life is all about. You know, they spawn, they eat, and they die. I mean, that's really pretty simple. And, you know, like I said, there's a lot of differences between spring and fall. You know, many of the same locations are going to be good. You know, we're talking about flats, we're talking about grass. You know, for instance, you know, maybe that last grass that's still alive in the fall is where they're going to be, or it's that first vegetation during the spring. You know, it's maybe the exact same place, you know, but they're going to be using it at different cycles of the year, if that makes sense. So, you know, that's just kind of some of my theories that I've learned through fishing. Like I said, a lot from, you know, pros that I've spoken to, that I've fished with, and, you know, and a lot of it that I've actually experienced firsthand. Okay. So we're going to kind of talk about spring a little bit. And, you know, this is one thing that, you know, I had some questions before we started this. You know, I sent out the, you know, the registration link, and some people, you know, had some questions beforehand. You know, they said, you know, how shallow should I be fishing when it's cold? You know, one of my biggest pieces of advice is do not be afraid to go very shallow. You know, that, like I said, that last remaining grass, you know, that can hold heat in a way. You know, it could be the last grass that, one, there's going to be, you know, less of it, less grass, so the fish are going to be congregated in that area. You know, the bluegill are going to be congregated in that area. The perch and everything else are going to be keying on that. So, you know, that last grass may be where to be. You know, but it's also could be the first live grass. And shallow water also warms up a lot faster in the spring. You know, and I have this picture here, you know, because this was an example of a fish that I caught in a tournament this year with, it was basically right after ice off, and it was in 3 feet of water. You know, it's because that's where they're looking to go, because the water is a little bit warmer. You know, they're looking for anything different. You know, maybe it's, you know, 2 degrees warmer because it is shallower and the sun is beating on it. So that can make a huge difference. You know, if the main lake is 40, but, you know, something that's 3 to 5 feet of water is 42, you know, that could be a huge change. And that's what those fish are looking for, is just a little bit warmer. I mean, think about when you're cold, and, you know, if you just could get warmer anyway, you know, put on another jacket or whatever it is, you know, that's gonna just make you feel more comfortable. And that's the same way for fish, but even more so because, you know, as you know, they're cold-blooded, so temperature really affects them. So that's, you know, kind of one of my theories on is do not be afraid to go shallow. And, you know, the on the opposite end of it, you know, this is really spring focused, you know, but kind of a side note, you know, this late fall that we just had into December, you know, went out on the lake, fish deep, you know, water was in the low 40s and didn't catch anything, but then went back a few more times and caught tons of fish in that under 10 feet of water, just because it has that last remaining grass, you know, and that's where the bluegill were, and that's where the perch were, and that's where the bass were. You know, way out deep, the fish weren't quite there, you know, whether it was just there was still something for them keeping them shallow, so they didn't need to be out there deep. So again, just don't be afraid to go really shallow, even if it's super, super cold. So, you know, again, I see some more people joining us. You know, this will be recorded. So if you have any questions, just feel free to shoot them off now. You know, we'll take a few breaks here in a few just to see what kind of questions we have so far. And then again, at the end, we'll go through all the questions that we missed. I'll be happy to answer them. And then also at the end of this, you know, you'll get an email from me with my email address on it. So just reply with any questions. I'd be happy to answer them and happy to help you out. All right, so moving along, we're going to talk a little bit about smallmouth and largemouth, because as we know, they're, you know, completely different species, totally different minds of their own, but they have a lot of similarities in my experience. You know, typically smallmouth are more known for, you know, cold water fishing, just because that's their, you know, really their natural habitat is the northern states. You know, that's where they were from. You know, their range is more northern, where largemouth is more southern, but they are very similar, again, because they need to eat, and they're going to act the same just because their whole purpose is to eat. So, you know, I think they're a lot more similar than you would think, you know, especially if you're talking about northern strain largemouth and smallmouth. You know, they do act very similar in what they're looking for and where they're going to be during the cold. And again, we'll talk about some locations, and we'll show you some maps, and I'll point out a few different areas that I think would be good for cold water, and some of them are, because they're places that I actually do fish, so I know that. So I'm kind of cheating a little bit and using some screenshots of places that I fish a lot. So, you know, another thing too is this northern strain versus Florida strain largemouth. You know, if you've ever fished for Florida strain largemouth, or really you've probably read somewhere along the way in a magazine how negatively they react to cold water. And it is so true. You know, like I briefly mentioned, I lived in Florida, and, you know, I always heard that, you know, Florida strain bass, you know, they have a cold front and they just shut down. And I just thought that was, you know, a lie, you know, but until you go down there and fish it, you know, it completely shuts off. It just can totally shut off. Like, you're not going to catch any fish. Like, I always use this example. I fished a tournament on Lake Okeechobee. You know, it was just a club tournament, not that big, but we fished and fished and fished out of the whole club, you know, 15 boats or so, and their co-anglers, and there's 4 bass caught. So that was a big cold front on Okeechobee. And right then I knew that that was true. Largemouth in Florida, or any Florida strain largemouth, really do shut down with the cold. So, you know, that just takes a lot different approach. You know, we'll kind of talk about some different baits. You know, in that tournament, I was actually fortunate to catch 1 2-pounder and got 2nd place. And it was just by fishing very slow and having some luck. But, you know, really the whole moral of the story is, you know, Florida strain bass hate cold water, and whatever you read is totally true. So if you've never experienced it, just believe me, it's very true. So, you know, like I said, how cold is cold? You know, that's going to make a huge difference if, you know, you are in Florida. You know, it's, you know, 50 to 55 is like frigid, you know, but here in Washington State, like I've said, that's warm. You know, the 40 to 45 and under 40, you know, that's completely different. So we're going to just take a quick second here, because we have hold on 1 second here. Hold on 1 second, guys. We do have a poll. Excuse me here, guys, but, you know, like I said, if you have any questions, just feel free to jump in and ask any questions that you possibly have. Let's see. Okay, we'll get back to this here in just a second, but my screen is gone, so hold on 1 second. Okay. Okay, we'll get to that in here in just a second, but we'll get to the poll. We're going to keep going here for just a second. Okay. Okay, so like I said, it just really depends on where you're from and what is cold for you. So now we'll just jump right into it. You know, we'll talk about different temperature ranges. You know, 50 to 55, you know, that's really not that cold for me, you know, and really it's a prime time for all types of baits. You know, there's plenty of activity. You know, you could catch them on just about everything in that depth, in that temperature range. You know, crankbaits, swim baits, really all the way up to topwater, you can catch them on that. You know, it's definitely a time when fishing's really good in my experience at 50 to 55, you know, both right, because it's kind of tipping into the pre-spawn, but then in the fall, you know, that's when they're starting to feed up. So that may be one of my favorite temperature ranges, because there's plenty of activity, the bait fish are around, the fish are doing all kinds of stuff, and it's really just a time for them to eat. Now, dropping down to the 40 to 45 or 40 to 50, you know, the bait selection is going to start narrowing down, you know, slower moving baits and longer pauses, you know, nothing as aggressive. You know, it's really topwater, in my experience, is going to be out of the question. You know, you're going to have to start changing your approach with that 40 to 50 degree range. Now that under the 40 degrees, you know, that's when it really, really slows down. And that's going to be a lot more with jerk baits. You know, I say the hair and metal, you know, that's going to be things like hair jigs, metal. I'm talking about, you know, spoons and blade baits and tail spinners and things like that. And then really just to start to slow down, because the fish are slowing down as well. Okay. So, you know, and then as far as the depth ranges and what I'm going to be targeting, you know, I'm going to talk about shallow and deep. You know, for me, shallow is 10 feet or less and deep is 20 foot or more. And I'd say 10 to 20 is kind of a mid-range. Again, this is going to be totally based on where you live. And, you know, where I fish and what I decide to do all depends on the forage. So this is a screenshot, and I use this same screenshot in my last webinar on using technology. You can see here it's 22 feet, 46-degree water, and there are bait fish down there, and there's bass under there. So this is, that's why they're in that 22 feet of water, because there's bait fish there. So a lot of it is going to be using your electronics to find that bait fish, to find the grass, and to find places where bass and bait fish are going to be. So rocks, grass, and warmth. You know, like I said, that's a lot of what I'm doing is using my electronics to find this. You know, you hear this all the time. Rocks retain heat. You know, they warm up faster. Everything else. You know, dying grass can also provide that warmth too. You know, it's, you know, you think of something that's black and dying, and that can actually retain some sunlight and actually be a little bit warmer. You know, and I actually just did an article with the pro recently, and he was talking about pre-spawn fishing, how he looks for docks that have, you know, the black plastic under them. You know, either it's the floats that are black, you know, and his theory is that actually helps to, you know, just add a little bit of warmth. And, you know, it makes sense. And that's really what it's all about. You know, like I mentioned earlier, a degree or two can make a huge difference. So really anything, either it's rocks or dying grass or something that's going to provide a little extra temperature is going to help out and, you know, keep those bass closer just to kind of stay warm. Okay, we are going to pause here for just a second. I'll see if I can get that Q&A situated. You can look at this picture of this. Isn't that bass like old looking? Yeah, that thing was like crazy. It looked like it was 30 years old. This thing is just give me a lot of trouble last time, so hopefully this update will fix it real quick. So again, sorry about this, guys. Okay, we're gonna keep going. But like I said, I'm gonna get all these questions at the end, but we're gonna jump right into lure selection, because that's a huge point, a part of maximizing your success with cold water. And I'll give you some of my favorite lures, talk about why, and then, you know, even some of my favorite baits and things like that, actual specific lures as well. So for cold water bass, you know, there's a wide range of baits that will work. You know, everything from jerk baits to drop shot to metal baits, like I said, hair jigs, crankbaits, and swim baits. You know, that sounds like a lot, but those are all baits that I use when the water's cold. So, you know, jerk baits, like I said, I just started off with this one because this is by far my favorite thing to do when it's cold. You know, this picture right here, this was, again, like 40 degrees out. You know, and the biggest key with jerk baits is having those long pauses. You know, you want to give those fish, those that are cold, a little bit extra time to find your bait and to bite it. You know, and this is true both early and late in the year. And typically I like those more slender jerk baits and those longer jerk baits. You know, like this is I'm a Flip 120, you know, the Megabass Vision 110 is awesome. The Spro Mix Stick 110, those are great baits. And the reason that I like the more slender baits is the action that it gives. You know, if you're going to have a short, you know, shorter bait for one, it's going to have a lot tighter darting action, and it may be moving too fast. Same thing with some of the bigger, thicker jerk baits. You know, the action may be a little bit more wobble, and it just may be too much action. So really, if any of these three baits or any copies of these exact baits are awesome to use. You know, they work. They perform. You know, I like them all. You know, and one thing that I do a lot is to use lighter line to give them more of a natural action, and then also to get a little bit more depth. You know, this was actually with 8-pound line, which is something that's fairly new to me, is to use that light of a line for jerk baits. But, you know, I personally think it makes a difference for, like I said, getting the bait down and just having a more natural action to what you're doing with it. So don't be afraid to, you know, go light. Typically, you're not going to be fishing around a lot of cover, so you can use 8-pound line, just play them easily, you know, unless you're catching giant bass, you'll be fine. So, you know, deep jerk baits is another thing. You know, this is something that I started doing a lot more of last year too. I mean, I kind of got away from that, but deep jerk baits work awesome. You know, it's the same principle, just deeper. You know, and it also allows you to target areas that, you know, most people don't use jerk baits, you know, like that. And when I'm talking about these, I'm talking 8 to 10 feet or so, where those other jerk baits are going to go down 4 to 6 feet. You know, just fishing a little bit deeper you know, those deeper grass lines, those deeper rocks, things like that, just reaching it is going to make you know, you're going to fish where most people don't use these jerk baits as much as they do the other ones. So, you know, as far as top baits, you know, I like the KVD deep jerk bait, which is what this is. You know, also the I'm a deep fry, and then the Vision 110 plus one. Those are great jerk baits. So like I said, I like using a lot of metal baits, and, you know, this kind of really, you know, increased over the years of me starting to fish for walleye using blade baits. And I've really learned how effective they are when it's cold, and they work great for smallmouth, as you can see here. So I do like throwing blade baits, you know, also spoons. You know, I haven't done that as much in the Northwest, but, you know, in other places with shad, you know, it's a great technique. You know, I'm sure it would work just fine up here, but, you know, anywhere there's shad, throwing a spoon in really deep water, you can catch fish that are really deep, and suspended fish as well, which is something that does happen with cold water. Tail spinners, and really most of these, even the tail spinner is more of a casting and retrieving. You know, this time of year when the water's cold, it's mostly vertical, and we'll talk about drop shot, or not drop shot, or we will, but we're going to talk about video game fishing here shortly. But really for me, it's best when the water is the low 40s or less. You know, I'm sure they'll work throughout the year, but I personally think they work better than anything else when the water's that cold. Anything a little bit warmer, you know, you can catch them better on other things. You can catch them on drop shot and different things than having to use this. Okay, hair jigs is another thing that, you know, it's ultra finesse. You know, some of these are like 3/32 ounce and super light, you know, but they're really lifelike. You know, that fur, whether it's a marabou or it's a synthetic like this one here, you know, it has a lot of action, but it's a natural action. You know, as you're stop the bait, it's just slowly flowing, and it's a really cool action, and it's something that you cannot get with plastics, because, you know, plastics do a great job of imitating all kinds of bait fish and things like that, but they just don't have that flowing action like a hair jig does. So it's a great thing to use when it's really cold. But, you know, kind of completely unrelated to this, they're also really good when the water's very hot as well. For some reason, I have a lot of success when the water's really warm as well. So it's kind of the two extremes. You know, when the fish are at their least energetic times, you know, that's a great thing to do, is to try hair jigs. And they look like little crappie jigs. I mean, some of these are, I think, really like this one, or that's a salmon and steelhead jig, but they work great for bass when the water's cold. And they can be fished very slowly. You can, and then just barely moving them, they're going to get a lot of action, but again, that natural action. But, you know, I don't just use hair jigs. I use straight up regular jigs, like finesse jigs, you know, and what I like to do is make it a lot more compact. You know, this style of jig has, you can see on there, it's trimmed, you know, the collar short. So it just makes it a little bit more compact, you know, versus two, you know, strands of the jig going all the way down there. It's just one. So it's just going to be a more compact design. And I think that that really helps when the water is really cold. So, you know, to kind of keep with that theme, you know, I like to use straight tail trailers or compact trailers, you know, nothing that's really too flapping. You know, it's, you know, those curl tails are good, you know, but you can get away with something like a sweet beaver, or something that just has a natural action like a crawdad that's not really aggressive, if that makes sense. And really this time of year, I fish it a lot more slowly. You know, I drag it more than I hop it. And then I prefer the football heads and the round heads quite a bit, because of where I'm fishing it around rocks and things like that. I think that those don't get hung up as much. So that's kind of what I stick to. This is actually a Dirty Jigs finesse jig, but a football head's great. And they work, you know, they work year round, but they do work really good when the water's cold. Crankbaits, you know, I love throwing crankbaits. This is actually my crankbait box picture from a few years ago. This was all the Rapala DT6 and DT10. I probably lost almost all these since then, because I used to use them all the time. I still think it's one of my favorite baits, but I found some other baits that work just as good. But typically when the water is 50 degrees or more is when I'll do it. So this is that 50 to 55 range. So they do work when it's colder, but again, kind of like when I was talking about the blade baits, I think there's things that catch them better when the water's warmer. So, you know, right around that 50 degrees, crankbaits really pick up, and then they kind of also taper off a little bit as the water is dropping. So I always like the flat cranks when the water's cold, and again, that 55 or less. I'm not going to use a big aggressive wobbling bait, like a square bill or something like that. So something that has that tight wobble, like these balsa baits. I do use a lot of balsa baits, like this one, like I was talking about, but I also am a huge fan of the IMA Pinjack 200, which looks very similar, but it's plastic. It has the same type of action, but you're not going to break them like you do all the time with these baits. That's one huge downfall of this. A lot of these, whenever I'd find them on sale, I'd buy every single DT6 I could when they're like $3, because I knew that I was going to break the bill eventually, or something's going to happen to it, or they're going to crack. But that's kind of what you get when you're fishing them around rock and you're fishing them a lot. But with that IMA bait, you don't get it as much because it's plastic. It's a little more durable. Same with that Strike King KVD 1.5 flat, which is right here. Kind of the same thing. It looks like that, but except it's not going to break all the time. That's, if I had one, one downfall for these, it's that you will break them all the time. So just a fair warning. So, and also if you get grass on them, do not slap it on, to take grass off of it. Actually take your time and pull it off, because you will break these a lot. Actually, a lot of baits. That's just a good practice to do. So we'll kind of get back to that, or get back to the presentation. I always do this, go off on tangents. All right, so swim baits, that's another thing that I love doing in the fall, especially, and typically for me, where it starts and ends is that 45-degree mark, and that's, maybe it's just mental, but that seems to be the best, 45 plus or down to 45. And also for me, it's a lot more in the fall. This picture was from a tournament on Lake Coeur d'Alene that was right before Thanksgiving, and it was all swim baits. So, when I'm talking swim baits, I'm talking jig head swim baits, and some of my favorites are Kitex, of course, can't beat those, and any of the knockoffs are okay. There's the Strike King one, there's the, everyone makes a Kitex, but I think the Kitex are the best, but there's still some of the knockoffs that are pretty good, and they're a lot less expensive. But some other ones that I really like are the AA's, the AA's Bad Bubba Shad, and the Rain's Rock Vibe Fat. Those are really good swim baits as well. And they're different because everybody throws a Kitex. If you know anybody that fishes for smallmouth in the fall, I'm sure everybody has Kitex. So it's kind of cool to give them something a little bit different, instead of just throwing the same thing that everybody else is throwing, because that does make a difference really with all presentations, as you know. So typically I'll fish on a jig head, and I'll fish at anything from like a 1/4 ounce all the way down to a 3/4 ounce, and that's just strictly depending on depth. If I'm going to be fishing 30 to 40 feet, I don't want to sit there and wait for a 1/4 ounce bait to sink all the time, so I'm going to use a 3/4 ounce. But I also often fish them on a swing head, and also known as the biffle head, or the any of those swinging head hooks. And in that case, I'll fish any of these swim baits, or really just the Rock Vibe Fat and the Kitex. But I'll fish on a swing head and fish them like a jig, dragging them in more of a, making a lot more contact with the bottom. And it is going to be a lot more weedless too, because it's not an exposed jig head. So that's just something to try when it's cold. And you could try it when it's warm out too. It's a good way to, again, give fish something a little bit different, and instead of just doing the same thing as everyone else, you can try that. It works really good. All right, moving along to one of my favorite techniques, the drop shot. But it's funny because I use a drop shot all the time, all the time. But when it's really cold, I don't use a drop shot as much. I think it's a technique that works better when the water's warm, summer, actually spring through fall. But if I do drop shot, I'm going to use small baits. I'm going to use a straight tail, something that doesn't have, tons of crazy appendages and action. Something subtle. And, I'm talking about small baits. These are all the baits that, are on my deck. And this is a 4.5-inch robo worm. And that's by far the biggest one, so we're talking 3 inches, 3.5. Just really small, compact baits, subtle baits. And then I also fish a lot of heavier weights. And if you saw my last webinar, we talked about that with video game fishing. And we're going to kind of use some of those same slides and do it again, just because I had a lot of feedback on those particular slides that we did last time for the video game fishing. So if you saw the last webinar, you're gonna have to listen to it again. So we'll go through it. It's real quick, but we'll talk about video game fishing now. This is a product of video game fishing. Oh, this day was so cold. I mean, it hurt driving, and that was the way to catch them, was video game fishing. And this is a 5-pounder, so it was definitely worthwhile. I put my gloves on right after this because it was freezing. So moving on, what is video game fishing? It's quite simply just using your graphs to see and then drop down to the fish. And it's a thing you can do with drop shots, spoons, blade baits, really anything vertical. It's something that you do need to set up your graph and have the right boat positioning just to make sure that you're doing it right. And, this is something I talked about at the last webinar. Don't rush out and buy like the most expensive electronics on the market. Don't go buy 3 16-inch graphs unless you want to, but you don't need that. Whatever you have probably will work. It really just comes down to learning really learning sonar and how it works, and more importantly, knowing where your transducer is and where you are. So if your transducer is right under the trolling motor, you need to drop it straight under the trolling motor, not over here or not over there. Get it as close to the transducer as you can. And one thing that you can do is use a lot heavier weight to get down there quicker. So, I'm talking a 1/2 ounce drop shot weight, a 3/4 ounce, even a 1 ounce. And you don't have to go buy those specific drop shot weights. You can buy those little bass casting sinkers that are like, 99 cents for 100 of them or whatever they are, 3 of them or whatever they are. You can just tie one of those on there, and you're not going to be casting it. So you're not going to have to, worry about, getting a new rod or anything like that. Your lure rating on your rod is one thing, but you're not going to be casting it. So don't worry about that. Really the whole thing is to get it down there quickly into the zone and into what your sonar is showing. That's really the biggest thing with video game fishing. And a lot of times I'll use smaller baits, baits that don't have, a lot of action, because that's going to allow them to drop faster. Personally, I use a lot of wacky rigs on a drop shot, but I don't when I'm video game fishing, because those wacky, the either end of the tail falling down, that's just going to slow it down. You want it to get down there as quickly as you can. Okay. But you can also do it with blade baits. You can do it with jigging spoons. You can do it with those ice jigs. They're actually made for ice fishing, but they work great vertically fishing and video game fishing. This is an example of what you can see by looking at your graph. This is my line dropping down on the fish, working up and down, and then getting a bite right there and reeling that fish in. This is just a section where the fish was out of the range, it darted over to the left or right, but this is what we all strive for. 46 degrees, 48.7 feet. So fish can be caught really deep. And I think this one wasn't very big, a couple pounder, but it was cool that I was able to see it on there. Kind of another side note, if you have a Lowrance and you want to get these video game shots, you see something cool on your graph or whatever it is, just hit the power and pages button, and that will save that to your graph, and then you can take it off with an SD card, post it, show everyone how cool your screenshot was. It's a lot better than just taking a picture of it where there's a reflection of you in it and everything else. So kind of a side note, but it's really easy to do, and that's what I do for all my screenshots. And yeah, like this is ideal. I mean, you want this. This is why you video game fish, to see fish, to catch them, and reel them in. I mean, that's what it's all about. So here's, like I said, we're going to kind of do stuff that we've already talked about in the last webinar, but there are a lot of tips that I've learned. Boat position is key. The faster you drop, the better. And really watch how that fish is acting. If it's streaking really quickly, moving around, that means that fish is active. And typically that fish is caught, as good as caught, if you do it right. Most of the time they bite it as soon as it hits there. Most of the time it's reaction strikes. You're dropping it right on them. They're not used to seeing baits drop on their head like that. So a lot of times they are going to bite it. You could really catch a lot of fish doing that, kind of surprising them, getting that reaction bite. Sometimes you'll have to work a little bit when it's a little bit colder, and that's what we're talking about, is that cold water fishing. But still, if you could see them on the graph, a lot of times they're pretty easy to catch, as long as you can get the bait down there quickly. And, again, knowing where your boat is, dropping it down there quickly so your boat hasn't drifted over 10 feet and your bait is, really far away. So, that's, you might as well not even do it. So just really just getting it down there as quickly as you can is key. All right, so we're going to talk about a few different locations, with cold water fishing. These are some screenshots from the Navionics website. The cool thing about the Navionics website is you can go to the chart viewer, which is right here. You can do all this for free. You don't have to download their app. I mean, you can if you want. It's an awesome app, but you don't have to. This is kind of a good way to try it before you buy it to see what you're going to get from the app. So it's a cool way to do it. Just go to the chart viewer, pull up your lake. Make sure you hit this button right here. You can't see it because it's popping it up, but it's, there's a little blue button down there. Just make sure that it says sonar chart on it. Click it and make sure that sonar chart is enabled. Sonar chart is the 1 foot contour intervals, which is why this looks all pretty here. And otherwise it's going to be, not quite as detailed. So you want to make sure you have that sonar chart enabled. So, okay, we're going to talk about some locations. This is Silver Lake here around Spokane. So, there's a few different areas. I'm just looking at this area. You see out here, this is a hump. This is a good location to catch fish when the water's cold, when the water's warm, because everything around here is really deep. As you can see, it drops off pretty quickly. And the reason I say that is because the lines are really closely together. So this is a nice location. This over here would be an awesome location as well because it's a nice flat, and you could tell that because the lines are further apart than they are over here. So those flat areas are where I'm going to be looking, later in the year as the water starts to die, or the grass starts to die, and the fish are looking for that last remaining grass. That's a good place to look. Then I would say that this area would be something that typically would be better, later when it's colder, especially on this deeper side of it here, as you can see here. That's another question I had too, is, just basically about reading the Navionics map, and just like reading on a paper map, the closer the lines, the steeper the drop. So I would say that as the water cools and continues to cool, they're going to be closer to these deep drops because they want to be out in this deeper water later in the year, but they still want to run up here. If suddenly there's a couple warm days in a row, they can jump up here and look around and see if there's any food. So they like that security of that deeper water, but you hear it all the time. They want access to shallow water, or access to deep water. Bass are really lazy. They want it all. They want to be able to have shallow, deep, grass, food all in one place, and also be able to spawn close by. So if you could find a place that offers all those things, a flat, deep water, grass, some kind of cover, whether it's rock, you're really made anytime that you fish any lake anywhere in the country if you can find all those things. And that's going to, again, vary based on where you live. Deep is relative to where you live, the forage and everything's going to be different, but in general, that's a good approach to be able to find all those things in one view without having to scroll around and look for all of them separately. So here's another screenshot. As you can see, this is a pretty crazy looking contour line. There's all kinds of stuff here. There's an underwater point over here. You can see this is a deep hole. As you can see here, 28, 29, where everything around just a little bit shallower. This is another underwater point. You can see over here, there's, flat, those thicker lines. And then the thinner line, just a really steep drop going down. So, talking about cold water fishing, I would say as the water is starting to cool down, you're going to look at areas like this down here, the flats that are close to deep water, and then the fish are going to slowly move out towards it. That's just, I can't remember exactly what lake this is, but because I took the screenshot of somewhere, but it's, this is another spot that has a lot going on, and that's something that somewhere in this view, you're going to be able to find fish in cold water, in warm water. It has a lot of features all in one little area. So that's kind of generally what I'm looking for, is something that has a lot in one screen without having to scroll around and find all these individual pieces. This is a cool screenshot because it has a lot of stuff. It has a creek coming out. This would be a place where they would be close. Maybe there's warmer water coming in, or cooler water coming in. There's just a lot of cool stuff going on here. And here's another one. This is Newman Lake. And, this is something that has a lot of features for this lake, because this lake, really doesn't have a lot to it. There's no real major humps or anything like that. So when you do find something like this, that's, a hump out in the middle of nowhere, it really stands out because everything else is really generally pretty flat. You could see these huge expanses where there's no lines because the water does not change depth very often. So, if you find something that, this may not look like that big of a deal compared to this place, but on a place where there's not a lot of features, it really makes a huge difference. So, you know, as the water is slowly getting warmer, you know, I know, for instance, this lake has stuff happening. You know, there's lily pads coming in over here and all that emergent vegetation. So those are good places to start early in the spring and then the last part of the fall as well. You know, and then you also have things over here, like you have a point back here. So there's just a lot of different areas on this lake. Again, this one isn't the best example because it doesn't have tons of features, doesn't have, you know, really underwater points or anything like that. It's pretty basic, but again, finding just something a little different makes a huge difference on a lake like this. All right, guys, so that's my talk. So we're gonna stop here for a second. I'm gonna tell you about my next webinars. We're gonna do a contest drawing, and then we're gonna do the Q&A section. Okay, so upcoming webinars. This one is today, so if you're just seeing this, you missed it. But the next one is March 21st, and that is actually a date change from what I said at the last time. You know, it was going to be like another date. I don't remember, the 27th or something. So this next one's going to be targeting pre-spawn bass. You know, we're going to talk about what I look for. It's going to be just kind of continuing our conversation, moving closer to the spawn and all the way up to the spawn, you know, baits, locations, everything else. So I will hope to see you at that one. So, all right, so go ahead and keep sending your questions. We're gonna get to those questions, but I did this contest before, right when I posted this whole webinar. You know, I talked about, you know, or I didn't talk about anything, but I said if you share this post or tag friends on Instagram, you're gonna win a prize pack from the co-sponsors of this event, and that's people from Optimum Baits, Ima Baits. There's some Cigar line in there, so there's all kinds of stuff. So I have names in here. I'll just do this real quick so you know it's official. All kinds of names. Whoever wins, I'll contact you, but it is going to be Chris Q. So we'll send that out to you, Chris. I'll hit you up afterwards. But we're gonna go ahead and see what questions we missed while I was talking for so long. Okay, so keep sending those questions. We'll get to them. They have disappeared from me. All right, cool. There they are. I got all the questions. So again, I apologize for that. I mean, they just disappeared on me. Okay, so, you know, typically when I do these, I like to kind of answer them as we go, but we're going to do it a little different this time. So, yeah, good to see you too, Mario. Oh, yeah, Adam. Yep, definitely. 3 feet of water and a boat wake. You know, that was talking about that fish that I caught really shallow in the spring. There was also a boat wake there. So, you know, maybe that's the key. Okay, so here's a question from Mario, and it's talking about working a jigging spoon in 45-degree water. You know, I've not been able to get a bass yet. You know, which knot do you use for, okay, so it's 2 questions. Okay, so for jigging spoon, you know, it's gonna really just depend on where the fish are. You know, typically when I would use a jigging spoon is when I'm seeing fish on the screen and they're suspended and there's not a better way to catch them. So if they're on the bottom, there's a lot of better ways to catch them. But if they are suspended, a jigging spoon is very good. You know, but really what's important is being able to know exactly where they are, and that's going to come with your electronics. So it's going to be watching your spoon or counting down so you're right where, you know, watching your spoon on the graph. So you make sure that you're right in the middle of them, because if you're jigging it 10 feet above them or 10 feet below them, you may not catch them. So it's really just getting it in front of their face and then just ripping it up and down through them. You know, that's really my best advice for it. Best knot for jerkbaits. Normally I just use a Palomar for everything, and, you know, jerkbaits included. You know, it's kind of a pain because you have to make that big, huge loop to make sure you don't get treble hooks marked, you know, all over the place. So still Palomar. I think it's still the strongest knot. It has never failed me, so I still do it no matter how much of a pain it is during cold water. Still do it. Oh, good question, Rick. Moving along. So what depths are you fishing jerkbaits, or does it not matter? I mean, really, whatever depth the fish are at. But like I said, those, you know, those popular jerkbaits like the Ima Flit, you know, that one actually dives a little bit deeper than, say, a Vision 110. You know, Vision 110 is 4 to 6 feet, where the Ima Flit is going to be, you know, like a 5 to 7 feet. So it gets down a little bit deeper. Jerkbait fishing, in my experience, is a lot more visual than a lot of other things. You know, it doesn't really matter as much about the rattle or the scent or, you know, any of that stuff. It's really about getting their attention. So a lot of times they'll come from a long distance to hit that jerkbait. So you can be fishing above them or below them, as long as they can see it. So the depth, I would say, typically 10 feet or so or less. You know, I'm not going to be fishing them in like 2 or 3 feet of water, maybe that 5 to 12 feet, I would say, unless I'm using those deeper jerk baits, then it's going to be a little bit deeper. Another good question, Mario. Have you found that metal baits work best on shad lakes? No, not really. I mean, they do work really good, especially like a tail spinner or a spoon. But as far as blade baits, all the lakes in Washington State have 0 shad, so they work really good. You know, they imitate a lot of different bait fish as well. So they do work in both lakes with shad and then without shad. Another good question. Can you fish a hair jig deep? Yes, definitely. It does take a lot more time to get it down there. But if I'm going to be fishing deeper, I'm going to be using something like it's a bait from Punisher lures that's 3/8 of an ounce. You know, a lot of those that I showed you were really tiny. They have one that's a 3/8 ounce. You know, and there's a lot of other versions similar to that you can fish a little bit deeper. Ty, good question, but you fished with me on Newman in March, so you know all my spots. So cool. So Chris, cool, you did win, so I'll hit you up and send this prize pack to you. Okay, one more good question here. How would you suggest fishing in shallow, grassy lakes when the water has cooled off after some warm weather? Let me just make sure I'm reading that right. Yeah, so I fish a lot of lakes similar to that, you know, that are shallow lakes that, you know, have cooled off, you know, really just still looking for that last remaining grass. You know, even in the dead of winter, a lot of times there's still some grass that's hanging on for life, you know, and that's going to be where they're at. So I would say looking for any grass that's still remaining, you know, maybe that means looking a little bit deeper typically, but, you know, still trying to find some grass, because if there's any grass with any sort of life, they're still going to be there close to it, because bass love grass. I mean, they always do. And it's something that's true all over the place. Okay, good question, Kevin. So what's the best cadence for a jerkbait? You know, typically I do jerk, jerk, pause, you know, jerk, jerk, pause. And really the main difference is how long you're going to pause the bait, you know, and as you're stopping it. As it cools down, you're going to be making a longer pause. You know, I was going to talk about this example, but, you know, I fished last fall, the water was 38 degrees, took my wife out with me. She was catching fish and I was not, because she was so cold that she was jerking it a couple times and just sitting there and waiting because she was trying to warm up, and she was getting bites when the bait was just sitting there still for who knows how long. You know, I asked her how long she was pausing it. She was like, I don't know, I was spacing off. I was thinking of our vacation to warm waters or warm weather. So the longer that you can handle it, you know, whether that's 10 seconds or 15 seconds, you know, that's definitely going to help your chances when the water is super, super cold. Good question, Kyle, on best way to fish for bass through the ice. You know, I've not caught many bass through the ice. You know, typically what I've caught is by accident fishing for perch, you know, with little jigging spoons. You know, Rains makes a really good small spoon. It's called the Powputin spoon. That's one that I know a lot of people catch tons of bass through the ice. You know, people that are a lot better at ice fishing than I am. You know, so I would say that would be a good approach. Just little spoons, just jigging and hoping for the best. You know, I don't do too much ice fishing. You know, and like I said, I've caught a handful of bass through the ice, but mostly, honestly, it was by accident. Never tried to catch them. So good question there. All right, any other questions, guys? You guys have been good. Sorry I didn't get to these sooner. Okay, another awesome question. So this is from Chris, and he's talking about early spring fishing and if you target outlets of rivers. And yes, sometimes, you know, it just depends on water temperature a lot of times. You know, where I live, a lot of times the water coming into a lake is going to be very cold. You know, that's going to be because it's ice melting, it's snow runoff. So typically it just depends on the water temperature, because sometimes that water is going to be cold, but it's warmer than what's in the lake. So it's actually going to be good. And anytime you can find current, it is generally a really good approach for bass fishing, because you're going to be able to, you know, the fish are looking for, you know, things are flowing out of the current. So there's, bait fish, there's nutrients, there's all kinds of stuff coming out of there. So, it just depends on the water temperature, but typically rivers or current or any kind of inflow is going to be a good approach. So it just depends on what the water temperature is of that outflow. All right, awesome question. I just see him right in here, Adam. So that's it. Okay, another good question. Kind of jig head do you use for your swim baits in deep water? My all-time favorite is the Revenge heads, and I just like the hook. I like the design. I like the paint job. But I just started pouring my own. And I haven't used them yet, but the new mold from Do It Molds, I think it's just called the swim bait head. Let's see if I have any over here. Where do they go? Yeah, I don't know where I put them, but they're really cool because they kind of cradle those Kitex and things like that. So, that's like I said, I like those Revenge heads, which are very similar to the VMC heads. And then also now I'm going to probably start using those Do It Molds ones just because they're more of a compact design and they cradle the bait, if that makes sense. Like there's a little bit of the lead that come in the weight is actually going to be under the swim bait. So it's a smaller bait that's heavier, or smaller hook, or smaller head, I should say. Okay, so good question. On spinner baits, some people use them in cold water and, never really thought of it as a cold water bait. It just depends on your approach. I think spinner baits in general just aren't as popular as they used to be. I mean, back in the day, everyone threw swim baits all the time. They work really well. Generally, if it's really cold, I would use something that's a little bit slower and has more vibration. So instead of a double willow, maybe a single Colorado is what I would think, just because it's going to have a little more vibration and it's harder to reel in. So you can't burn it as fast as you can with willow. So I would say that'd be my approach for spinner baits. Really need to throw spinner bait more. It's, with swim jigs and chatterbaits and swim baits, I just kind of don't use spinner baits quite as much as I used to. I think a lot of people are like that too. Cool. Any other questions, guys? Hey, you guys have been great. A lot of really good questions. I appreciate it. Makes it good. And like I said, if we have any other questions, you could just hit me up. I'll always tell you everything I know. All right. You're welcome, Chris. All right. We're going to go ahead and end here, but I appreciate every one of you for attending. And again, this will be on YouTube. I'll put mine up tonight, and then Navionics will have it on theirs tomorrow. So we'll see you guys in the next one.